Here in Ottawa today, Liberal MP Anthony Housefather reflected on the October 7th attack by Hamas.
The Canadian Jewish community is absolutely shattered. People don't know what to think. They're sad, they're horrified, they're angry. Everybody knows somebody that's been deeply affected. I've never seen our community feel more insecure in Canada in my lifetime.
Jewish community leaders in Canada were gathered in the capital for a summit to fight anti-Semitism. Irwin Cotler was there. He is the outgoing special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. And Mr. Cotler also previously served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General under Prime Minister Paul Martin. Irwin Cotler, thank you so much for coming in.
Good to be here.
You were in Israel on October 7th. You were there for a wedding, and it turned into, as you described it, the most horrible day for Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. What was it like being there as this was unfolding?
Well, you know, it started off as to be a celebratory day. It was the last day of Sukkot, a holiday which is the Jewish Thanksgiving, which really celebrates our common humanity. And that holiday of our common humanity turned into a three-pronged criminal aggression and invasion by Hamas. At the beginning, when the air raid sirens went off just as we were about to depart for the synagogue, we were used to it. We felt, well, you know, just another warning. But then this foreshadowed the launching of 500 rockets in a few hours. And then we start to hear agonizing cries. You know, when you're living in Jerusalem, where we're only 60 miles away from the border. Right. It's like if you're in Montreal and the terrorist attack is taking place in Saint-Agathe. And before we knew it, we had these anguished cries of people who were being targeted by terrorists in different villages and communities and the like. And then we were hearing about atrocities that were being committed. Before the day was out, we're then 350 dead and some 800 wounded. Now as we're meeting,
way worse. Yeah.
It's way worse. It is, as I said, the worst day since the Holocaust. And what we had here was a criminal aggression, not just by a terrorist group, Hamas, but a group that is an anti-Semitic genocidal group, not because I say so, but because their founding charter says so. They publicly call for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. They've been reaffirming this. And it's not only that they assault Israel, they effectively keep their own Palestinian citizens under massive repression. So they're now taking Israelis hostages, but the Palestinians in Gaza are also hostages to Hamas's really genocidal agenda.
Right. They've been oppressed. They've been used as human shields. Their freedom, you know, has also been curtailed by, you know, Hamas, which Canada and others have designated as a terrorist organization. But we've seen domestically here a lot of protests since then. We've seen people out protesting with Palestinian flags, saying they're there to support Palestinians and the conditions they live in. Others who are refusing to condemn Hamas for what has happened, calling it a legitimate act of resistance. And then the fear and anxiety that Anthony Housefather talked about amongst the Jewish population of Canada. Where do you think Canada is right now in this wave of protests and counter-protests and argument?
Well, I have to say, you know, when I think back historically, and I think I said this morning, that in 1943, when the Jews tried to get in touch with their government leaders, et cetera, they couldn't even get meetings.
Right.
Now we've had public condemnations. Chris Brown mentioned President Biden maybe coming to Israel, and he's discussed what has been happening as being pure evil. And we've seen this, all the prime ministers and heads of state of the community of democracies, et cetera. So what we've seen is that they have been standing up, understanding that Hamas is both targeting Israel with its criminal aggression and, as you said, in a double war crime, using its own citizens as human shields. That's at the political leadership level. What we are seeing somewhere in the population are people who've internalized some of this hatred over the years because it exploded now. But the Hamas charter since 1988, this kind of propagation of this anti-Semitic hate has been going on now for 25 years. And so, and when it explodes on the social media, and Hamas is very good at using the social media, then people internalize this willy-nilly, and before you know it, you get what appear to be protests, but protests that end up, in fact, glorifying terrorism, ending up giving a justification, and that has to be unmasked and that has to be exposed because it's basically un-Canadian. It's not simply a matter whether you're pro or against Israel. It's un-Canadian to be engaged in that kind of vindication or validation of the worst forms of hatred and terrorism.
So how does the country move ahead with this anger on display? I mean, the Prime Minister in his speech today in the House of Commons talked about the need for care for each other and understanding for each other to try to calm the waters, I think, a little bit. And he said that in Canada, diversity is our strength, but it feels like that is going to be tested or is being tested. So how do we move forward?
Well, I think it's correct that diversity, pluralism, inclusion, that is our strength. And that's what's on the line. What we have to understand, for example, is anti-Semitism is not just threatening to Jews. As my colleague Ahmed Shahid put it, it's toxic to democracies. It's an assault on our common humanity. It's the canary in the mine shaft of global evil. While it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. Before you know it, and we heard this at the conference today in the afternoon, it envelops all other groups. And so we have to engage in common cause here, because it's not just a matter of this being a Jewish issue. It's a fundamental issue of protecting our democracy, protecting our human rights. We have to work in allyship. Jews have to be there to support Muslims or blacks or indigenous people if they are ever being discriminated against or under assault, and the same has to be held true. That's what diversity, inclusion, and pluralism is all about. Working together in common cause, working together in allyship, seeing this as a matter of protecting our democracy, our fundamental human rights. This is what Canada is all about.
I watched your speech this morning, and I would describe it as an overwhelming amount of somberness about the situation, with the hope you mentioned that this is not 1943. Political leaders will come to will support Jews, will support Israel, will meet with them. But on that darkness that you spoke of, what do you want Canadians, what do Canadians need to know about anti-Semitism right now in the country, especially in the wake of what's happened?
Well, I think they need to know that anti-Semitism is not only the longest, most enduring, most toxic, and most lethal of hatreds, but that if you don't combat anti-Semitism, it will envelop us all in that hatred. And while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so, as I say, this is a battle for the hearts and minds of people. This is a battle for our fundamental human rights. We are the people of the Charter. In the age of the Charter, we have to, in fact, give expression to our fundamental freedoms under the Charter. And we have to work together in that kind of allyship and that kind of unity. Otherwise, a fracturing or fragmentation will take place. We have to use the resources of what it means to be Canadian. The things that you mentioned about diversity and inclusion and rights, etc., and say that's what's at stake here. Anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred. It metastasized. It's got to be combated, and it's got to be combated in common cause.
Just one final point. How worried are you now that this expands and spirals? The conflict we're seeing right now in Israel, seeing noise out of Iran. We've seen, shelling from Hezbollah coming out of Lebanon, and just enormous diplomatic efforts to try to keep the lid on what is happening there. How concerned are you right now that this could
I'm
spiral?
worried because Iran is behind a lot of this. Iran both arms, finances, trains, operates, encourages both Hezbollah and Hamas. They're both, in effect, terrorist proxies of Iran. The tentacles of Iran are everywhere. And so we have to hold Iran, the regime, accountable. And I always say we have to distinguish between the regime in Iran and the people in Iran who are under massive domestic repression. Interestingly enough, it's the people of Iran, the diaspora of Iran, wherever you see them, they're the strongest supporters for Israel at this point because they understand what it's all about. And they know that Iran, the regime in Iran, is that which is pulling a lot of the strings, and that's where the accountability has to be found as well.
Irwin Cotler, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. That's Irwin Cotler, the outgoing Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.